Rockets, hero cosmonauts, and triumphant grainy footage were the polished face of Soviet space glory. But behind that shine was a system built on secrecy, pressure, and some very ugly truths. To the outside world, the Soviet Union looked unstoppable in the early years of the space race. It launched Sputnik, sent Yuri Gagarin into orbit, and made the United States look flat-footed more than once. But that public image came with a carefully managed script. Failures were buried, suffering was softened, and whole programs were denied until the Soviet Union itself was gone. This is the darker side of that story: the cover-ups, the hidden weapons, the moon plans they pretended not to have, and the disturbing human cost behind the headlines. And since every secret program comes with blame attached, tell us in the comments which hidden chapter surprises you the most: Laika, the lost cosmonauts, the moon plan, the space cannon, or Buran. Laika.
A dog knocked a goat right out of the world's attention today. In a masterpiece of propaganda timing, the Soviet Union announced it had launched Sputnik No. 2, carrying a live dog. This is reportedly history's first space traveler.
One of the most famous animals of the 20th century was also one of the earliest victims of Cold War propaganda. Laika, the small Moscow stray sent into orbit aboard Sputnik 2 in November 1957, was presented as a brave pioneer, helping science take a giant leap forward. That part was true. What was not true was the gentle story the Soviet state told afterward. Officials admitted fairly quickly that Laika would not survive the mission, but for decades they insisted she died painlessly after several days in orbit. That version made the mission sound sad but noble. It turned a brutal experiment into a controlled sacrifice. It also helped preserve the image of a program that seemed technologically brilliant and morally composed. The reality was much worse. Later disclosures showed that Laika had already endured harsh conditioning on Earth, including being confined in tiny spaces for long stretches to prepare for the capsule. Once inside Sputnik 2, she could barely move. The craft did include systems meant to support her, but the mission went wrong almost immediately once the heat and stress of launch took over. Instead of surviving for days, Laika appears to have died within hours from overheating and panic. That detail matters because it reveals how the Soviet program handled uncomfortable truths. The mission still counted as a propaganda victory, so the suffering was hidden behind a cleaner story. Laika became a symbol of progress, while the reality of her death was buried for decades. Lost voices.
I mean, it looked like he was going to make it back to the ground after this really pretty disastrous mission, and then the parachutes failed and he crashed back down to Earth. He probably died on the way back just from the G-forces. When he hit the ground, the spacecraft then caught fire because of a fault with the retro rockets.
Few stories from the space race are as eerie as the so-called lost cosmonauts. According to legend, Soviet pilots died in secret space missions before Yuri Gagarin's famous flight, and the state erased them from history. The story gained power because of recordings said to have been captured by Italian radio operators who claimed they heard desperate voices from doomed Soviet spacecraft. It's the kind of tale that sounds almost too cinematic to ignore. A hidden launch, a failing capsule, a final call from orbit, and then silence. In a less secretive system, the story might have faded quickly, but the Soviet Union had already trained the world to suspect it was hiding far more than it admitted. That suspicion was not irrational. The Soviets really did suppress disastrous incidents, including the death of cosmonaut trainee Valentin Bondarenko, whose fatal training accident was concealed for years. Once people learned that one death had been hidden, it became easier to believe that others had been hidden too. The hard part is proof. Investigations into the lost cosmonaut claims have never produced solid evidence that these secret orbital deaths actually happened. So this chapter sits in an uneasy place between rumor and possibility. But even if the legend remains unproven, the reason it survived is revealing in itself. Soviet secrecy was so extreme that even the most dramatic stories never sounded entirely impossible. Moon denial.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful from here, Neil.
The Soviet Union loved to act as if the American rush to the moon was flashy and reckless. Publicly, Soviet officials downplayed lunar landings and spoke as though their real interest was in more practical goals like orbital stations. For a long time, that posture created the impression that the moon was mostly an American obsession. That turned out to be nonsense. Behind closed doors, the Soviets were chasing the moon too. The outside world did not get a clear look at how serious that effort had been until much later, when relics of the program and its equipment were finally shown to visiting scientists. By then, the myth had already done its work. What made the deception especially striking was the scale of the ambition. This was not a half-hearted thought experiment. The Soviets had developed lunar hardware and return systems that showed they truly intended to land cosmonauts on the moon. The main problem was not lack of desire. It was lack of reliable heavy lift power to get the mission off the ground. That failure was easier to swallow if the public never knew the race had been real in the first place. So the state leaned into denial. Instead of admitting they were trying and losing, they pretended they had chosen a wiser path all along. It was a classic Cold War move. If you can't claim victory, rewrite the contest. Gunmetal Orbit.
It is also notable that although Salyut 6 does serve certain military purposes, mostly of an observational nature, the Soviets prefer to project its purely scientific nature.
If the moon cover-up showed how far Soviet leaders would go to protect prestige, the Almaz program showed how far they were willing to go to militarize space in secret. These stations were not just scientific platforms, they were manned spy outposts, and in one of the strangest twists of the space race, they were armed. Mounted on one Almaz station was a modified R-23M cannon, adapted for use in orbit. Yes, an actual gun in space. It had originally been designed for military aircraft, then reworked into a weapon that could defend the station from what the Soviet planners feared might someday be American anti-satellite attacks. That detail stayed hidden for years because it collided with the image both superpowers liked to project. Space was supposed to look like a frontier of science and national prestige, not an armed extension of the Cold War battlefield. Yet the logic of competition kept pulling both sides towards military thinking, even above the atmosphere. The most amazing part is the gun was reportedly test-fired in space after the crew had left the station, with thrusters used to offset recoil. It was not some forgotten drawing on a planning board. It was a real weapon deployed in orbit. That tells you everything about the paranoia of the era. Even the heavens were not safe from the urge to weaponize advantage. Buran. By the time the United States unveiled the space shuttle era, the Soviets saw more than a reusable spacecraft. They saw strategic danger. In their eyes, the American shuttle might become a military tool, and that fear helped drive one of the most fascinating secret projects of the late Cold War, Buran. To many observers, Buran looked like a copy of the American shuttle, and visually, it certainly did. But the Soviet craft had important differences. It relied on a different launch setup, had impressive cargo potential, and could even fly without a crew through remote control. That last point alone made it feel a little like a machine from the future. Its development also reflected another hidden layer of the Soviet approach. When open collection of American shuttle information became harder, Soviet intelligence reportedly turned toward early computer intrusions and electronic espionage. That makes Buran part of a broader story, not just about engineering, but about how badly the Soviet state wanted to avoid falling behind. And yet, Buran's story ends in a way that feels almost symbolic. After all that secrecy, effort, and ambition, it flew just once in 1988. Then the Soviet system began collapsing under its own weight. The program was canceled not long after. So one of the most advanced and secretive Soviet spacecraft ever built became the ghost of a dying empire. Brilliant in some ways, but born too late to matter. Now it's time to hear from you. Which of these hidden stories says the most about the real Soviet space program? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below.